Online at pointofview.net. This is Bible School Radio, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, and KYJC Commerce. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, what is the latest on student loan forgiveness? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, it has been an ongoing storyline. Will or will there not be student loan forgiveness? Today, Prudent Money contributor and college admissions expert John Hupalo is here to get us up to date. John, so what is the latest on this ongoing battle in Washington?
Hey, Bob, do you remember that movie Groundhog Day where you
Yes.
repeat things over and you make a step forward? And so we're kind of in the same mix with this. So there's an article out last week, actually, that I thought was really terrific. And I don't mean to make light of this whole situation, but it says, "Supremely in Limbo" was the article title and the headline. And I think that's exactly it. So we've talked about this before, not to beat the dead horse, but the Biden administration proposed student loan forgiveness that would help some 43 million students. About 26 million of them applied. When all that was going on, some court cases popped up. The Supreme Court put it on their docket. The end of February, they held a hearing on two of the cases. And precisely where it stands now is where it stands the last time we talked about this, which is that we are waiting now for the Supreme Court to weigh in. And I think most of the experts right now are saying, you know what, this will most likely be decided sometime in June by the court, because that's about the time they start handing down a bunch of decisions. By the way, February to June in court time is lickety split. It's pretty quick. So they are expected again to rule in June. What this means for students is that they remain supremely in limbo. Their repayments will begin either 60 days after the Supreme Court decision is made. So sometime between now and call June 30th, then it'll be 60 days later. If there is not a Supreme Court decision in June, which, by the way, is highly unlikely, but if there's not, then they are scheduled to start their repayment on September 1st. So I wish I could tell you definitively that this is over, but it's coming to an end, or at least this part of the saga is coming to an end, and we should know in the next 6 or 8 weeks the way this will work out.
I mean, do you see this being resolved before the 2024 elections, or something that can just be stretched out to for political purposes, as in, look what Biden failed to get done? Or do you think it will get resolved and it'll be done?
Oh, I used to believe that it was going to get resolved and get done, but that was about 2 years ago. Don't forget, the students have not had to make payments since the 2020. But here's the reason for concern. Very recently, last Thursday, in fact, the Supreme Court ruled on another case related to this whole borrower-student repayment issue. It's somewhat unrelated in that it was a very specific thing about students who went to schools that were somehow engaged in harmful or conduct that was misrepresenting or made false promises about what their programs were. It's called this borrower defense thing. So some schools said, oh, you know what, these loans should be forgiven. Not really, because we provided what we said we would do, and the Department of Education said, oh, no, we want to forgive all these loans because these schools did bad things. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the administration could go and forgive about $6 billion of these loans to 300,000 students. And now you're going to say, so, John, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Here's where the rub can be. There was a little piece of that decision that said, well, it may be that the Secretary of Education can, and the technical language says that it can enforce pay compromise. That's the word that has to be underlined. Compromised, waive, or release in any way right title claim or liens to demands of these loans. Now, all of a sudden, Bob, just the other day, a new trial balloon went up and said, guess what? If the Supreme Court rules against student loan forgiveness, maybe because the court ruled the way it did last week, we can circle back on this and see if we can get the Secretary of Education to forgive all these loans under this compromise clause. So the lawyers are going to have a field day with all of this. Borrowers are going to get stuck not knowing what's really going on, and we might be talking about this in another year or so from now.
Okay, so everything that you've heard, and you stay real close to this, what's your gut tell you that this is going to happen?
I think what's going to happen is that the Supreme Court's going to come back and rule against the Biden administration. And the Biden administration is going to say, oh, you know what? 60 days is not really enough time to get all these repayments started. And coincidentally, 60 days would take you somewhere around the 1st of September. And, Bob, we know that the federal fiscal year ends the end of September.
Right.
So I think that maybe they'll kind of kick the can for another month and say we'll start them in the next budget year or sometime after that. But, again, I am not very good when it comes to understanding, like, what the politics of all this might be in the background. But I think there is now, with this new avenue after last week's Supreme Court ruling, you might be right in thinking that this could get kicked down the road way past the next election. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it really is. So tell me something. We've really never discussed this. How is interest treated during the deferment? I mean, there's interest on what would be forgiven, and then there is interest accumulated on the whole amount. Did that interest amount in total or the amount that is forgiven still accrue during the deferment period? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And there are a bunch of terms out there. There's deferment, there's forbearance, and then there's that word they used very, I'm going to say, creatively called pause. So when in September of 2020, right when the pandemic hit, they craftily said, we're going to pause payments. And that means you don't have to pay. And also we're going to set the interest rate to 0 on the loans. And so there's no interest accruing on loans that the federal government owns. So you're asking the right question. In the old days, like before 2020, when students actually had to pay on their loans for the obligations they had outstanding, if you went to your student loan servicer and said, I want a deferment or a forbearance, the interest would continue to accrue on most of the loans. And the interest would continue to accrue, and if you didn't pay the interest, then it would get stuck onto the end of your balance, and the balance would keep going up. But in this new world of the pause, for the student loans that the government owns, there's no interest accruing. And the last little thing, and I'm sure your listeners are saying, oh, this is just ridiculously complicated, and fortunately it is. But this pause only affects the loans that the government owns. There are a bunch of loans out there that the government actually doesn't own, and those loans were subject to other things. You know, but to answer your question, no. Right now, all those loans are 0 interest, 0 payment due, no balances are increasing.
Well, you know, if you look at the amount of interest that would normally be owed that was given that they didn't accrue interest, I mean, that's a pretty significant gift of money.
It's hundreds of billions of dollars. There was a calculation done, I think it was last summer actually, that said if the repayment started, I think it was around September 1st last year, somewhere around there, it was something like $330 billion of interest would have been forgiven at that point. So yeah, you're right. It's real money. It's adding up fast, but it's also, from some perspectives, kind of fake money, right? Because it's in the budget, and you know, what's a couple $100 billion among friends when you're talking about the U.S. government's budget? No
doubt. Well, another item we've been keeping an eye on is academic testing. This is something that we started to see a shift maybe before. I think you'd agree with this, John, before COVID, and because of COVID, academic testing has undergone some pretty big shifts. What are you seeing today with testing, and where do you think the trends will go?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob, because it was swinging. The pendulum swung actually pretty hard. So most schools for many years required the SAT and or the ACTs, and they were very strict about all that. And then, as you said, around the time of the pandemic, there were just all kinds of issues administering the test. And then others sort of jumped on the bandwagon and said, well, not only are we having trouble getting kids to these centers and getting them tested properly and all the rest of it, there was a lot of stuff going on. They started to say, well, I think that the schools are saying, we think there's a better way to start evaluating students. And so a lot of them went test optional, saying if you want to take the test, you can do that and send in your scores. Some of them said straight out, no test required. And there is a big trend in that direction. It's actually starting to trend back the other way. And most of the counselors that I talk to say that they're advising their students to take the exams and take the ACT or take the SAT because some of the academic merit money has been tied to exam scores. They've seen some trends where you have a better chance, frankly, of getting into that school rather than sort of backing in without the testing and using the other criteria that they were using. So it seems like it's starting to settle out, and the highly selective schools now are going back toward the trend of asking students to take that test or requiring students to take the test again.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Talking to John Hupalo, who comes on the program once a month and talks a little bit about what he's seeing in a very expensive part of so many people's life, which is funding college. And if you want to go to a great website, if you are in a situation where your child is in that time period of looking at colleges, getting ready to maybe a freshman, John always says it starts then as getting prepared for college, then go check out his website, mycollegecorner.com. It's got a lot of great information. So let's talk a little bit about, I was thinking about this, and nobody, I used my youngest child, Grayson, as a good example. I don't think anybody was more excited than he was to find out that, wow, there's schools that don't take the SAT and the ACT. Maybe I can get out of taking it. Of course, his mother did not let that allow that to happen. But I got to think, though, that, and I can just think this in as far as he goes, is that if I'm getting ready, trying to get into a college, and I know that the college I really want to get into doesn't really care if I take the ACT or the SAT, and my grades are more than good enough, how hard am I really going to try?
Yeah, and I think what you're highlighting, Bob, is every situation is different, right?
Yeah,
and
sure.
I would go to the school counselors, and they know the student, they know the school they want to get to, they know the profiles, and those counselors are pretty good about ballparking what your chance of admission might be. So that might work, perfectly well. There's another circumstance here that I meant to mention before. My younger daughter is dyslexic, and so she doesn't do well on those exams from a process perspective. So she gets all kinds of accommodations, and coming back around, it's funny you said that about Grayson, because Emily's going to go and actually get an MBA next year, but her criteria was very simple. When she came home on Thanksgiving and said, by the way, I want to pursue this, and after Terry and I picked our jaws off the ground because we didn't think she'd ever want to go back to school, she said, I'm going to find a school that will give me a waiver for those tests because I've been in the tech field. And sure enough, she found two schools that she thought would be terrific for her, and she avoided taking those exams. So the reason I bring this up, and I think your example with Grayson is exactly right, is that it's really up to the student, and the undergraduates, the parents have more influence than I would with my 27-year-old. But they sort of know what's right, and they can do the research and find the best answer for them when they really put their minds to it. So it might be that test optional or no test required school will fit perfectly well for some student who wants to go to XYZ school, knows what program they might want to get into. And that could work really well and not have to go through the torment of taking those exams.
I tell you what, though, the more you think about it, a high SAT or ACT score certainly is not going to hurt your chances, and could be the one thing that pushes you over the edge in a competitive situation trying to get into a school. You should never know.
You never know. And the other thing, as I said before, you actually might get some money for it, right? They might have, some of those schools have like presidential scholars or like whatever they might be, and that could be it. And again, if your students where they're really competitive and they can go get a great score on those tests, those students absolutely should take the exam, because they could really earn some money and reduce the amount that they have to put in to pay for school, or the amount of loans that they have to take for school. So again, sort of generalization, push comes to shove, I think students are better off taking the exam than not, but a good number of students don't have to take the exam. They'll go to a great college and they'll have a terrific experience.
Now, you mentioned this a second ago. Talk a little bit more about the evaluation methodology that could end up replacing testing. I mean, to me, if you think about it, for colleges, it's so easy to set a bar and say, if you don't get at least this, don't bother. And without that, you really have to it seemed like you have to get pretty creative with a new methodology to evaluate students on whether they should be given acceptance or not.
Bob, there's no question about that, and there's also no real answer to it, because although when Alice and Emily were out looking for schools and we went to those school visits, it's almost like a joke after a while, because you'd sit down at those orientations and they'd all say the same thing: we want a well-rounded class, and we look at and we don't have well. The reality is, when they get 20,000 applications or whatever, they have strict cutoffs. Like they look, right, and there's something going on for a lot of those schools. But when they said, and during the COVID years, when they really couldn't maybe have all those students take the exams and they had to reevaluate it, they still have to have some way of sorting, right? It's just they have to. Just realistically, how are 20 or 30 people even on an admissions committee going to read 20,000 applications, right? It doesn't make any sense. And I think some of the criteria they've used is what's your rank in your high school class, what's your GPA. There are other ways for them to get a pretty good idea of academically where that student fits in. And the other thing the colleges know, and this is where the high school counselors are really helpful. Those colleges, particularly where they're kind of feeder schools, so high schools tend to send their students to the same sort of set of schools generally, right? And because the colleges then know, if it turns out that Emily is in the top third of her class at this particular high school, she's going to likely compare well to another student who maybe is in the top fifth in this other class, or whatever it might be. But they start to get a feel for how rigorous the academic environment is at the high school, and that helps them assemble their college class. So the thought that, the idea that, write this wonderful essay and you have some really great recommendations and somehow someone in the middle of the pack is going to get into Harvard, it's not going to happen, right? So they've got ways of doing that, and I think they've become better at it in the last few years because they've had to.
It would be interesting, and of course there could have been a report done, or research done on this, but if you took two groups of students, you took a group of students who did very well in academic testing versus the group of students who had, say, a 3.8 and higher, which one ended up doing better? It would be interesting to see if you put a couple of groups together just to test it out and see what would make sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to say the anti-testing group only because I don't know a better way to say it right now, but the group who questions the value of testing will tell you that they have a lot of research that shows that testing is not necessarily an indicator of how well a student will perform in college, how well they'll do, whether they'll be persistent. And we see it, Bob, with our children, our friends' children, and the like. There's that certain thing where the kids got it or they don't. They're going to go to school and they can be successful sort of no matter what happens, or maybe it's just not for them. And it doesn't really matter what their grades were in high school or what the test score is. What matters is when they start maturing, they go from 17, 18, 19, 20, and they're starting to get into that process. Well, what works for them and what doesn't work. And there's a lot of that chemistry that has to occur. And that's what helps drive some of that success. And a lot of the research has been done and said, it doesn't matter what the test score is. It's not a predictor of the success that a student will have in college.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. If you want more information on John, his website's a great resource, a lot of free information. MyCollegeCorner.com is the name of the website. Let's talk a little bit about, and this is a question that came in, about colleges accept students based on grades as one criteria. What happens if they are accepted at one GPA and their grades really fall over their senior year? As far as most schools, does that matter?
I'm going to say it matters marginally. If you've gone, if there's some dramatic drop off for some reason, there's some tragedies occurred in the family and there's loss of concentration, whatever, that's one thing. If it's just that the student got into school, an early decision, and then all of a sudden, they completely took the time out, there might be some explaining to do. I know there was one situation, and it happened in my daughter's class, where a student was accepted. Unfortunately, this young man and some of his friends decided to do some things that they shouldn't have been doing in a high school parking lot with involved some alcohol one night. And this was a sport, an athlete who's going to play, and it turned out that his acceptance was reneged as a result of the character thing. So, it's not a sure thing, but it's also, Bob, not common, right? I think the schools, once they assemble the class, they want to get you in, but there's no such thing as, sort of matriculating and showing up on campus until you actually do. And you can do some things in this spring of your senior year that could put a lot of that really great work that you've done over the last 4 years in jeopardy. So, same general rule. Stupid things sometimes result in some really bad results. And I'm going to say, particularly in the environments that we've been in the last 4 or 5 years, where it becomes exacerbated and blown out of proportion in a lot of ways. So obviously try to be smart and don't put yourself in that position.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking about how important that conversation is to have with your kids in high school, because you can throw a lot of that hard work, a lot of everything you've achieved right down the toilet, if you will. And just one mistake could really end up just completely changing your future as far as college goes.
Yeah, no, in a lot of ways. I remember, bless her soul, my mother's favorite phrase was, there but for the grace of God go I, because when I think about some of the stupid things I've done, and I've gotten away with it, but I know, and so I'm knocking on wood.
I hear you. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. If you want more information about John, MyCollegeCorner.com is the place to go. John, always great to have you on the program. Look forward to next month.
That's all. Time really flew today, Bob. Thanks. Great talking to you. Be well. Enjoy the spring.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. I think I spent a lot of time talking to, as I think back, talking to my kids just about decisions, how important good decisions are, that you make good decisions. And there's one of the things that I want to be, that maybe we'll talk about this next month, is making good decisions once you get into school, because all it takes is just one bad move, and things could change for a lifetime. This is Bob Brooks. If you had a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.